Is there any better setting for a paranormal encounter than a deserted, twisting country road? Probably not, which is why New Hampshire, US Route 3, is the perfect location for the setting of the Betty and Barney Hill abduction. Just outside of Lincoln, New Hampshire, sits State Historical Marker 224, which reads,
On the night of September 19th and 20th, 1961, Portsmouth, New Hampshire couple Betty and Barney Hill experienced a close encounter with an unidentified flying object and 2 hours of lost time while driving south on Route 3 near Lincoln. They filed an official Air Force Project Blue Book report of a brightly lit cigar-shaped craft the next day, but were not public with their story until it was leaked in the Boston Traveler in 1965. This was the first widely reported UFO abduction report in the United States.
The Hills lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where Betty worked as a social worker with the Child Welfare Department, and Barney commuted to Boston and worked with the United States Postal Service. They were an interracial couple, active in their community, church, and in the civil rights movement. By all accounts, they were normal, friendly, and certainly not prone to hysteria or wild stories. But at about 10:30 p.m. on September 19th, 1961, their story got very wild.
Betty and Barney had been in Niagara Falls and Montreal for a vacation, an impulsive short getaway to celebrate their honeymoon, which the couple had postponed for 16 months. There was a hurricane approaching Portsmouth, and the Hills wanted to get home before the weather got worse. They left Vermont around 10 p.m., planning to be back in Portsmouth by 2 or 3 a.m.
As they were driving home late into the night, Betty spotted something in the night sky that she first thought was a falling star. The light, however, seemed to be moving erratically and soon became bigger and brighter in the night sky. Betty urged Barney to pull the car over and to take a look, which he did, stopping at a scenic picnic area just south of Twin Mountain.
Betty grabbed a pair of binoculars the couple had in the car and observed an odd-shaped craft flashing multicolored lights travel across the face of the moon. Barney, with the binoculars, then observed what he reasoned was a commercial airliner traveling towards Vermont on its way to Montreal. However, he soon changed his mind because without looking as if it had turned, the craft rapidly descended in his direction. This observation caused Barney to realize that whatever this object was, it was not a plane. Betty's sister had claimed to have seen a flying saucer several years earlier, and Betty postulated that this might be what they were observing. This unnerved the couple, and they quickly returned to their car and drove towards Franconian Notch, a narrow, mountainous stretch of the road.
As the Hills drove slowly through the notch, the light seemed to follow the car. The light would follow the curve of the road, seeming to duck past the moon and behind the trees and mountain ridges, and then reappear in a moment. Betty testified that it was at least 1.5 times the length of the granite cliff profile, which was 40 feet long, and that it seemed to be rotating. The couple watched as the silent, illuminated craft moved erratically and bounced back and forth in the night sky, seemingly playing a game with them. With his military knowledge, Barney knew that the flying craft they saw that night was too quiet to be a helicopter, commercial plane, or even a military jet. He didn't want to worry Betty, but the lights concerned him.
Approximately 1 mile south of Indian Head, the object rapidly descended toward the vehicle, causing Barney to stop in the middle of the highway. The huge, silent craft hovered approximately 80 to 100 feet above the Hills' 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air and filled the entire field of view of the front windshield, carrying his pistol in his pocket. Now you may be asking yourself why he had a pistol in his pocket, but clearly the answer to this question is because it's America. He stepped away from the vehicle and moved closer to the object. Using the binoculars, Barney claimed to have seen about 8 to 11 humanoid figures, all peering out the craft's windows. All of the humanoids but one backed away from the windows as the silent craft continued to approach, getting to what Barney estimated was within 50 to 80 feet overhead and 300 feet away from him. He attempted to raise his gun but found that he could not lift his arm. Barney then claims to have received a telepathic message telling him to
stay where you are.
Terrified, Barney ran back to the car, hysterically yelling, "They're going to capture us!" The object was now directly above the vehicle. Barney threw the car into drive and sped off, asking Betty to keep a lookout for the object. Betty kept an eye on the craft, even craning her head outside the car window. Almost immediately, the Hills heard a rhythmic series of beeping and buzzing sounds, which they said seemed to bounce off the trunk of their vehicle. The car vibrated, and a tingling sensation passed through the Hills' bodies, causing them to enter into an altered state of consciousness that left their minds fuzzy and dulled. Immediately, both Barney and Betty became drowsy and fainted.
The next thing the Hills remember is a second series of beeping and buzzing sounds that returned the couple to full consciousness. Upon waking, the couple found that approximately 2 hours of time had passed and that they were somehow 35 miles down the road. Confused, they continued on their way to Portsmouth, where they tried to make sense of what had happened. Their only recollections included making a sudden unplanned turn, encountering a roadblock, and observing a fiery orb in the road.
Arriving home about dawn, the Hills felt strange and reported having some odd sensations and impulses that they really couldn't explain. For instance, Betty insisted their luggage be kept near the back door. Their watches had stopped working, the leather strap on the binoculars was torn, the toes of Barney's best dress shoes were scraped, and Barney said he was compelled to examine his genitals in the bathroom, though he found nothing unusual. They both also felt really dirty or contaminated and were compelled to take long showers.
Perplexed, the Hills tried to reconstruct the chronology, finding their memories incomplete and fragmented. After sleeping for a few hours, Betty awoke and placed the shoes and clothing she had worn the previous night into her closet. Later, when she retrieved the items, she observed that the dress was irreparably damaged, torn at the hem, zipper, and lining. There was also some type of pinkish powder on the dress. She decided to throw it away, but then changed her mind, retrieving the dress and hanging it back into her closet. Over the years, the dress and the pink material have been independently tested by 5 different laboratories, all coming back with results that the material was organic, had no known source, and was consistent with high UV exposure. Betty and Barney also examined their car and found several strange, shiny concentric circles on the trunk.
On September 21st, Betty telephoned Pease Air Force Base to report their UFO encounter, though for fear of being labeled eccentric, she withheld some of the details. On September 22nd, Major Paul W. Henderson telephoned the Hills for a more detailed interview. Henderson's report, dated September 26, determined that the Hills had probably misidentified the planet Jupiter. His report was forwarded to Project Blue Book, the U.S. Air Force UFO research project.
Within days of the encounter, Betty borrowed a UFO book from the local library. It had been written by retired Marine Corps Major Donald E. Kehoe, who was also the head of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, or the NICPA, a civilian UFO research group. On September 26th, Betty wrote to Kehoe. She related the full story, including the details about the humanoid figures that Barney had observed through the binoculars. Betty wrote that she and Barney were considering hypnosis to help recall what had happened. Her letter was eventually passed on to Walter N. Webb, a Boston astronomer and member of the NICAP.
Webb met with the Hills on October 21, 1961. In a 6-hour interview, the Hills related all they could remember of the UFO encounter. Barney asserted that he had developed a sort of mental block and that he suspected there were some portions of the event that he did not wish to remember. He described in detail all that he could remember about the craft and the appearance of the somehow not human figures aboard the craft. Webb stated that they were telling the truth and the incident probably occurred exactly as reported, except for some minor uncertainties and technicalities that must be tolerated in any such observations where human judgment is involved. These uncertainties included the exact time, length of visibility, apparent size of objects and occupants, and the distance and height of the object.
10 days after the alleged UFO encounter, Betty began having a series of very vivid nightmares. The dreams continued for 5 successive nights and were very detailed, intense, and occupied her every thought. When she mentioned them to Barney, he was sympathetic but was not too concerned, and the matter was dropped.
In November 1961, Betty began writing down the details of her dreams. In one dream, she and Barney encountered a roadblock where several men surrounded their car. She lost consciousness but regained it again. Upon gaining consciousness, she realized that she was being forced by two small men to walk in the forest at night along with Barney. She called to him, but he didn't respond, being in a trance or sleepwalking type state. She describes the men as standing about 5 feet to 5 feet 4 inches tall and wearing matching blue uniforms with caps similar to those worn by military cadets. They appeared nearly human, with black hair, dark eyes, prominent noses, and bluish lips. Their skin was a grayish color.
In the dreams, Betty and Barney and the men walked up a ramp into a disc-shaped craft of metallic appearance. Once inside, Barney and Betty were separated. She protested, but was told by the man she called the leader that if she and Barney were examined together, it would take much longer to conduct the exams. She and Barney were then taken into separate rooms.
Betty then dreamt that a new man, similar to the others, entered to conduct her exam with the leader. Betty called this new man the examiner and said he had a pleasant, calm manner. Although the leader and the examiner spoke to her in English, the examiner's command of the language seemed imperfect, and she had difficulty understanding him.
The examiner told Betty that he would conduct a few tests to note the difference between humans and the craft's occupants. She was seated on a chair, and a bright light illuminated her. The man cut off a lock of Betty's hair. He examined her eyes, ears, mouth, teeth, throat, and hands. He saved trimmings from her fingernails. After examining her legs and feet, the man used a dull knife, similar to a letter opener, to scrape some of her skin onto what resembled cellophane. He then tested her nervous system, thrusting a needle into her navel, which caused Betty agonizing pain. The leader, upon seeing Betty's discomfort, waved his hands over her eyes, vanishing the pain.
At one point during her examination, the beings ran into the room. They were excited because they had discovered that Barney's teeth could be removed. Betty explained that Barney had dentures. They seemed to struggle to understand this concept. The examiner left the room, and Betty engaged in a conversation with the leader. She picked up a book with rows of strange symbols that the leader said she could take home with her. In this conversation, she asked the leader where he came from, and he pulled down an instructional map dotted with stars. He then asked her to show him on the map where she was from. She was unable to do this. He then joked with her, stating,
"If you do not know where you are, there wouldn't be any point in telling you where I am."
In Betty's dream account, the men were escorting the Hills off the ship when a disagreement broke out. The disagreement was apparently about the book. The leader then informed Betty that she could not keep the book, stating that they were going to remove her memories of the encounter. She and Barney were then taken to their car, where the leader told them to wait until the craft departed. They did so and then resumed their drive home.
On November 25, 1961, the Hills were again interviewed at length by NICAP members C.D. Jackson and Robert E. Homan. It was during this interview that the Hills were asked about the missing time. Although the Hills noted that they arrived home later than anticipated, they apparently didn't realize that their 4-hour trip had turned into a 7-hour trip. When Homan and Jackson noted this discrepancy, the couple had no explanation. The Hills claimed to recall nearly nothing of the missing 3 hours other than an image of a fiery orb sitting on the ground. The subject of hypnosis was suggested in order to elicit previously irretrievable memories. Barney was apprehensive, but thought it might help Betty put to rest her terrible dreams.
On November 23, 1962, the Hills attended a meeting at their church, where they met Captain Ben H. Sweat of the United States Air Force, who had just lectured the group on hypnosis. The Hills approached Sweat privately and related their strange encounter, and while Sweat was particularly interested in the missing time aspect of the Hills' account, when the Hills asked if he would hypnotize them to recover their memories, Sweat declined, and cautioned them against going to an amateur hypnotist such as himself.
On September 7, 1963, Captain Sweat returned and gave another lecture on hypnosis to the church group. After the lecture, the Hills told him that Barney was going to a psychiatrist, a Mr. Stevens, whom he liked and trusted. Captain Sweat suggested that Barney ask Stevens about the use of hypnosis in this case. When Barney next met with Stevens, he asked about hypnosis, and Stevens referred the Hills to Benjamin Simon.
Simon began hypnotizing the Hills on January 4th, 1964. He hypnotized Betty and Barney several times each, and the sessions lasted until June 6th, 1964. Simon conducted the sessions on Barney and Betty separately, so that they could not overhear one another's recollections. At the end of each session, he reinstated amnesia.
Simon hypnotized Barney first. His recall of witnessing non-human figures was quite emotional, punctuated with expressions of fear, emotional outbursts, and incredulity. Barney said that, due to his fear, he kept his eyes closed for much of the abduction and physical examination. Based on these early responses, Simon told Barney that he would not remember the hypnosis sessions until he was certain he could remember them without being further traumatized.
Why doesn't it go away? Look at it. Calm. Not gonna hurt you. Did they have faces like other people? You say one reminded you of a red-headed Irishman. His eyes were slanted. I see it so. His eyes were slanted. Just stay there, he's saying to me. All right. I'll dig in my head. Just don't pull the binoculars away. God, give me strength. All right. Pull them down. Run! Pull these binoculars down and run. God! If there's my God, give me strength. I gotta get away. Oh! Betty! We gotta get away, Betty! All right. Calm down. I'm driving. I gotta get away.
Under hypnosis, Barney reported that the binocular strap had broken when he had run from the UFO back to his car. He recalled driving the car away from the UFO, but that afterwards he felt irresistibly compelled to pull off the road and drive into the woods. He eventually sighted 6 men standing in the dirt road. The car stalled and 3 of the men approached the car. They told Barney not to fear them. He was still anxious, however, and he reported that the leader told Barney to close his eyes.
Barney described the beings as generally similar to Betty's hypnotic recollections. The beings often stared into his eyes, said Barney, with a terrifying, mesmerizing effect. Under hypnosis, Barney said things like, "Oh, those eyes. They're there in my brain." And, "I was told to close my eyes because I saw 2 eyes coming close to mine, and I felt like the eyes had pushed into my eyes. All I see are these eyes. I'm not even afraid that they're not connected to a body. They're just there. They're just up close to me, pressing against my eyes."
Barney related that he and Betty were taken into the disc-shaped craft, where they were separated. He was escorted to a room by 3 of the men and told to lie on a small rectangular exam table. Unlike Betty, Barney's narrative of the exam was less detailed, as he continued to keep his eyes closed for most of the exam. A cup-like device was placed over his genitals. He did not experience an orgasm, but felt that a sperm sample had been taken. The men scraped his skin and peered into his eyes and his mouth. A thin tube or cylinder was inserted into his anus and quickly removed. Someone felt his spine and seemed to be counting his vertebrae.
Betty reported a conversation with the leader that she understood in English. Barney said that he heard them speaking in a mumbling language he did not understand, yet he also understood them in English. Betty also mentioned this detail. The few times they communicated with him, Barney said it seemed to be through thought transference. At the time, he was unfamiliar with the word telepathy. Both Betty and Barney stated that they hadn't observed the beings' mouths moving when they communicated in English with them.
He recalled being escorted from the ship and taken to his car. In a daze, he watched the ship leave. Barney remembered a light appearing on the road, and said, "Oh no, not again." He recalled Betty's speculation that the light might have been the moon, though the moon had set several hours earlier.
Under hypnosis, Betty's account was similar to her 5 dreams about the UFO abduction, with some notable differences, mainly pertaining to her capture and release. Also, the technology on the craft was different. The short men differed significantly in physical appearance, and the sequential order of their abduction differed. Barney and Betty's memories in hypnotic regression were, however, consistent with one another. Betty exhibited considerable emotional distress when recounting her capture and examination. Simon ended one session early because tears were flowing down her cheeks.
Simon gave Betty the post-hypnotic suggestion that she could sketch a copy of the star map that she later described as a 3-dimensional projection similar to a hologram. The star map that she had seen had many stars, but she only drew those stars that stood out in her memory. Her map consisted of 12 prominent stars connected by lines and 3 lesser ones that formed a distinctive triangle. She said that she was told that the stars connected by solid lines formed trade routes, whereas dashed lines were to less traveled stars.
After the hypnosis sessions, Simon speculated that Barney's recollection of the UFO encounter was possibly a fantasy inspired by Betty's dreams. Simon thought it was the most reasonable and consistent explanation. Barney rejected this idea, noting that while their memories were consistent in some regards, there were also portions of both their narratives that were unique to each. Barney was now ready to accept that they had been abducted by the occupants of a UFO, though he never embraced it as fully as Betty did. Though the Hills and Simon disagree about the cause of their distress, they all concurred that the hypnosis sessions were effective. The Hills were no longer tormented by abduction anxiety.
After the hypnosis sessions, the Hills went back to their regular lives. They were willing to discuss the alleged UFO encounter with friends, family, and the occasional UFO researcher, but never sought publicity. That publicity, however, came whether they wanted it or not on October 25, 1965, when reporter John H. Luttrell of the Boston Traveler broke their story on the front page in an article entitled "UFO Chiller, Did They Seize Couple?" Luttrell apparently got the story from an audio tape recording of a lecture that the Hills had given in late 1963, and from notes that he had obtained from confidential interviews the Hills had given to UFO investigators. On October 26, United Press International picked up Luttrell's story, and before long, the Hills story went international.
Since then, the Hills story has continued to grace TV, film, books, graphic novels, radio shows, and podcasts galore. One of the most popular being The Interrupted Journey, written in 1966 by writer John G. Fuller. Fuller wrote the book with the full cooperation of the Hills and Simon. The book was a major success. The Hills story continues even to this day to hold a place in history as an intriguing and interesting account. It introduced the great alien into pop culture, and it was the beginning of the entire alien abduction phenomenon. Their experience, while sometimes refuted, is still studied and actively researched.
Barney died of a cerebral hemorrhage on February 25, 1969, at the age of 46. Betty died of cancer on October 17, 2004, at the age of 85. She never remarried, but claimed to have continued to have UFO experiences throughout her entire life. She never denied any of the events of September the 19th, 1961.